And so they're all going off of, we don't have the evidence, we haven't seen it, it's absent. Well, you can't prove or demonstrate that an event didn't happen by a lack of archaeological evidence, because you might find it later, and in this case, I think we have found quite a bit. You can say we don't know from that, but you need contradictory evidence to say, no, this is not the story that happened.
Dr. Kennedy, when we look at archaeology and we hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it sounds very sort of mystical and ancient, but what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? How were they found, and why are they important?
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, for some people, have been the most significant archaeological discovery connected to the Bible. Now, I would say that in one way this is correct if we're talking about ancient manuscripts, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are our oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament books. And before they were found, our oldest manuscripts were from about the 10th century AD. As far as Hebrew manuscripts, we had some older Greek translations, but these pushed it back more than 1,000 years. So incredibly important in terms of the text of the Bible, and also showing that the Old Testament hasn't changed over the centuries, that they were copying these texts very, very precisely. So that's a very important aspect of it. They were discovered by accident, actually, initially, and then some other texts were discovered intentionally when archaeologists went to find more. But they were discovered, the story goes, by a shepherd boy who was throwing rocks to get his sheep to go where he wanted them to, and he hit a clay jar and heard this sound. And so he went to look at it, and inside this jar apparently were a bunch of the scrolls. So they took them back to their camp, and they knew that they were worth something, but they didn't know exactly what they were. And ended up buyers on the antiquities market got a hold of them, and some scholars realized what they were and how important they were, and eventually they were bought back by the government of Israel. And so now most of them are in the Shrine of the Book in the Israel Museum.
As part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've heard of something called the Great Isaiah Scroll. What is that, and what makes that part of the scroll so important?
Yeah, that is one of the most incredible scrolls and one of the most important ones. It's the entire book of Isaiah. First of all, it's incredible that the whole thing is preserved like that. So a lot of the books, we don't have every verse. The scrolls have been damaged, and we might be missing large sections. We actually don't have the book of Esther, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, although we have parts of every other book. But the Great Isaiah Scroll is also one of the oldest, maybe even the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. When radiocarbon dating was done on it, they placed it around 300 BC or so, and some of the new calibrations for radiocarbon dating might even push it back to as early as 350 BC. So we're talking about, this is getting really close to the time when the Old Testament was written. So last books were written in the 5th century BC. We're talking the 4th century BC here, very, very close. And this scroll, of course, contains prophecies also about Jesus. But we have the scroll from more than 300 years before Jesus lived. And so you can't fabricate that prophecy, and there's no argument that scholars can make. They've got to try to come up with some other explanation. So very important for the text of the Bible, for the historicity, and for the prophecy.
One of the biggest stories, one of the biggest events in biblical history is the Great Exodus. The Great Exodus of the Jewish people out of Egypt. What archaeological evidence, if any, do we have for the Exodus?
This is one of those things in the Old Testament and the Bible that is really considered to be myth in mainstream circles and in secular scholarship. And in their view, it was settled a long time ago, and so they don't really think about doing new research into the issue. But there is, in fact, a lot of archaeological evidence that points to the Exodus. And we have things like Papyrus Brooklyn that attests to people with biblical Hebrew names as servants in Egypt before the time of the Exodus. We have other interesting evidence, like the cities that are mentioned in Exodus. We know that they were in existence at that time, and they were occupied by Semitic slaves, which would include the Hebrews, and that parts of these places even seem to have been abandoned around the time of the Exodus.
So is there any evidence archaeologically that contradicts the assertion that the Exodus took place?
I would say no. Really, the arguments that you're looking at are arguments from absence of evidence. If you read scholars who don't believe the Exodus happened, their main points are going to be things like, there's no evidence of Israelites or Hebrews in Egypt before the Exodus. There's no evidence of the events of the Exodus. There's no evidence of the wandering of the Israelites in Sinai. And often they would even say, like, there's no evidence of the incursion, the movement of these people into Canaan and the conquest. And so they're all going off of, we don't have the evidence. We haven't seen it. It's absent. Well, you can't prove or demonstrate that an event didn't happen by a lack of archaeological evidence, because you might find it later. And in this case, I think we have found quite a bit. You can say we don't know from that, but you need contradictory evidence to say, no, this is not the story that happened.
Okay, so there's a claim out there that I want you to debunk it or verify it if you can, about some ancient Egyptian chariot wheels at the bottom of the Dead Sea.
No, those aren't ancient Egyptian chariot wheels. So unfortunately, that's been circulating around the internet for quite some time. But no Egyptian chariot wheels found there yet. Maybe if people keep looking in a lot of different possible locations of that crossing, maybe we'll find some remnant of the army, but we haven't yet.
Okay, what about the story of Jericho and the walls coming crashing down? What does archaeology tell us about that?
So Jericho is one of the most important sites in terms of establishing that a conquest actually happened, that the Israelites came into the Promised Land, and the events that are written in Joshua occurred. Now, Jericho is another one of those that many skeptical scholars like to say this didn't happen. It's a mythical account. And some of them actually would say it's a contradictory account. That is, that what's found at Jericho contradicts the biblical narrative. But in fact, it corroborates it really well. So one, we know where Jericho is located. So Jericho's been found. It was under existence in ancient times. Mm-hmm. The second thing we look at is the manner of destruction. The walls fell down, right? And then the city got burned. Well, if you go and you look at the archaeology of Jericho, the final Bronze Age city, the walls fell down upon themselves and kind of formed this ramp so you could walk up into the city. And then there's a massive fire destruction layer over the whole place. So that fits with the way that the story is told. And then there's all these pots, these big storage jars full of grain. So the people didn't loot the city also, which is another component of the city. And the time of year too. And so really then what it comes down to is a debate over when did that happen. So an earlier excavator of Jericho, John Garstang, he excavated extensively there, and he said that it looked like from the archaeology it was destroyed about 1400 BC, which he then connected with Joshua. Then a later archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, went there, and she actually found a lot of really interesting stuff, but she said that it was destroyed earlier, like in 1550 BC, and so it had nothing to do with the Israelites. But if we go back and look at some of the specific archaeological material, we can say that it was about 1400 BC in the time of Joshua. There's things like Egyptian scarab seals of pharaohs from that time. The last one is a pharaoh, Amenhotep III, who reigned around 1400. No pharaohs after him. The pottery that's discovered there, some special kind of exotic wares we can date between 1500 and 1400 BC. And then there's a gap. There's that destruction, there's a gap. So it really seems like a very strong site in terms of establishing the historical reliability of the Bible and the book of Joshua here.
Wow, that is so cool. I find all this just so fascinating. Are there any other locations, stories that can be validated by archaeology that you find particularly interesting?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting stories, and again, one of the best attested ones from the Old Testament, is the story of Hezekiah and Sennacherib when the Assyrians came and assaulted Judah and Jerusalem. So we have a pretty long narrative in the Bible about this and the events leading up to it. All sorts of characters involved, whether it's a Babylonian king or whether it's Hezekiah or it's Sennacherib or it's generals and so forth. Cities like Lachish and Azekah are mentioned, and then Jerusalem. And if we go there and we dig up, say, Lachish, we see that the Assyrians formed a siege ramp and they destroyed the city and they killed a bunch of people. They even made stone-carved reliefs that they put in their palace in Nineveh depicting that siege and destruction of Lachish with the name there. And then they talk about the whole campaign against Judah in their official annals. It's called the Sennacherib Prisms. So they wrote in cuneiform the account of all these military activities that he did. And he mentions Hezekiah, he mentions the siege in Jerusalem, he mentions that he subdued the other towns in Judah. So all this stuff, all these characters, all these places, all the events of the battle. The one thing that the Assyrians don't mention is when they were besieging Jerusalem and they failed to take the city, when all those officers and mighty warriors got killed. They just stop at the siege and don't talk about that because it was typical for ancient cultures like that to not recount their losses, their embarrassments, their failures. But we've got everything else in that whole story is corroborated archaeologically.